What was the scariest, most chilling? I have a bad feeling about this experience. Story 1, I do real estate photography. One day I was alone shooting in an empty house, which is quite normal. I had this really uncomfortable feeling that I was not alone. I had already checked the whole house before I started taking photos, but I kept getting the feeling that someone else was there. The feeling was so strong that I had goosebumps and felt nauseous. I am not a small guy, but I felt like a little kid scared of the dark. I decided to recheck all the rooms to ease my mind, but I did not find anything. I checked closets, bathrooms, bedrooms, and everything else, but I was definitely the only one there. As I finished shooting the last room in the house, this feeling that someone was with me was so overwhelming that I pretty much sprinted out of the house when I took the last shot. I felt better when I got outside, but I still had an uneasy feeling. The realtor ended up pulling into the driveway as I was finishing photos of the front of the house and asked if the house cleaner did a good job. I said it looked fine to me, and she went into the house with her husband to prepare it for a showing. When I was shooting the backyard, I noticed them both out of the corner of my eye through a back window, but there was a third person with them. I was confused because they came alone without anyone else. It turns out the house cleaner was not finished before I pulled up and came inside. She saw a large guy with tattoos come into the house in panic, so she jumped into the kitchen pantry and hid. By the time she realized I was the photographer, it was too late for her to come out without it being awkward, so she stayed in the pantry the entire time. I am not sure if maybe I saw her out of the corner of my eye when walking past, or if maybe I smelled her perfume or heard her breathing without realizing it, but my subconscious was screaming at me that someone was there. It was the most uncomfortable I have ever been inside a house like that before, and it made for a funny story afterward. Story 2, when I was around 12, I lived in downtown Toronto, and I was walking home late at night from the streetcar stop because I was coming home from swim practice. Both my brothers had hockey in different parts of the city, so I was on my own. That is when I noticed two guys behind me. They were matching my speed, and I could hear them talking about my clothes. I was already pretty paranoid, so I crossed to the other side of the street, which was not very well lit, to see if they were actually following me. They were. My heart just sank into my stomach. There was a serial attacker running around my neighborhood at the time whose type was, unfortunately, exactly like me, and women of Eastern European descent, also me, had been going missing lately. I just started running, full sprint. I did not even look at the road when I was crossing the street again, but I was 12 being chased by fully grown men, and I was 2 blocks from my house. They were getting closer and closer, and I was terrified, trying not to cry, and just keep running. I was at the corner where I would turn onto my street, and I could feel one of their hands reach out and brush against my shoulder, then again through my hair. He grabbed on and started to pull. Before I could even scream, the guy who grabbed me was completely tackled by a homeless man who usually camped out near the library. He sat on the man who grabbed me and started punching his accomplice. I was scared and confused and just stood there crying until the homeless man yelled for me to run and not stop running. That snapped me back to reality, and I ran all the way home, triple checking that every door and window was locked, keeping the lights off until my parents got home. We called the police, but all the officers in my neighborhood were either corrupt or incompetent, which is why the serial attacker was never caught, and nothing came of it. A couple of days later, my parents and I found the homeless man and offered him food and supplies to thank him. We talked for a bit and found out he had been discharged from the Canadian Armed Forces and was not adjusting well to being back. I saw him around for about a month after that and would say hello, sometimes giving him a juice box or spare change if I had any. Eventually, my parents found his family in another city and contacted them, and they came to get him. My parents are still in touch with him. It was a slow process with plenty of setbacks, but he is doing really well now, and I am so happy for him. If it had not been for him, something truly horrible would have happened to me that night, and I will always be grateful he was there. After that, I was not allowed out on my own past 6 in the evening, and I always had a ride from swim practice, whether it was a relative, a friend's parent, or a family friend. Story 3. It was about 9 or 10 in the evening, and I was heading home from a really bad date. It was a 10-minute walk from where I was to my home, and I stopped at a red light to wait. It was the middle of the week, and on the way from my date to the red light, I had only seen about one person, so there were not many people out. Out of nowhere, I got a really bad feeling, and I knew someone was watching me. I turned around, and there was a man right beside me, standing just a bit too close. He saw that I had noticed him and started talking about how nice the summer rain was. I ignored him and started walking, even though the light was still red. He started walking too. I sped up, and so did he. My fight or flight response kicked in, and suddenly I stopped walking. He was caught off guard and took a few more steps before stopping as well. He asked why I stopped, and I almost yelled at him that I did not want to speak to him, that his behavior was freaking me out, and told him to keep walking. He started to argue, and I yelled at him to just go. He began walking slowly, and I stood still, watching him as he moved away. The feeling in my stomach did not go away. It actually got worse. He stopped near a bus stop, and for a moment I felt relieved, thinking he was waiting for the bus. Right next to the bus stop, though, was a dark alley, and behind it was an even darker parking lot. He kept staring at me, waiting. I tried to contact a friend with no answer, then hid behind some construction materials, and on the third try, I finally reached her. She was not home and could not help, but she asked if there was anyone else around. I said no. Eventually, a man and two women walked by, and she told me to tell them what was happening. During all of this, the man never stopped staring at me. When I walked up to the group and asked if I could walk with them, he suddenly started walking away. I knew then that he had been waiting for me. I walked with the group for a short while, but they were turning left at the next red light, and I needed to go the other direction. I thanked them for helping me, and we separated. Within seconds, the man showed up again. I froze completely, but thankfully the group noticed and ran back to me. When the man saw them, he turned around and walked away. They walked me all the way to my doorstep, and I thanked them over and over again. I am completely certain that he planned to do something terrible to me that night, and I am forever grateful to those three strangers who may have saved my life. Story 4. I lived in South Africa, where home invasions were often extremely brutal. I grew up on a plot of land and lived in a flat adjacent to the main house. One night, I woke up randomly around 2 in the morning with a strong, tingling feeling that something was not right. I opened my flat door to look outside and see if anything was going on, but the feeling did not go away, so I decided to get dressed and do a walk around the garden. Before leaving my flat, something told me to peek through the door, and when I did, I saw a man walking around the house. I immediately called my sister, who lived in the main house, but there was no answer. I then called my stepmother, and after a while my sister answered, which already felt strange. I told her to wake up immediately and check the house, making sure all the doors and windows were closed because there was someone in the garden. She kept trying to dismiss it and even said she would unlock the house door so I could come inside. I told her that was a terrible idea and that I was not going outside, since burglars are usually armed and dangerous and I had nothing to protect myself with. During our call, my sister missed a breath, something that usually only happens when someone is frightened. So instinctively, I told her that if everything was all right, she should say yes twice. She only said it once. It turned out that a group of men had already made it inside the house and had a gun to her head, forcing her to convince me to leave my flat. A few seconds later, the automatic light outside my flat turned on. I told my sister it was okay and that I was going back to sleep. Then I immediately called the police and the neighborhood watch, which took the longest 30 minutes of my life to arrive. When I finally saw the police lights outside, I had to make a 100-meter dash to the gate to open it for them. I explained everything that had happened, and we began investigating the property together. We walked the perimeter until we found where the men had entered, then went inside the house, which was completely trashed. When we reached the main room, there was a blanket covering the bed. I pulled it off and found my entire family underneath, tied up, terrified, and partially unclothed, including my 1-year-old niece. If it had not been for my instincts, they would not have hesitated to kill me and possibly do worse to my family. They had already poisoned my dogs. To this day, I believe something was watching over me that night. Story 5. After I graduated high school, I worked at a video rental store in a strip mall in a small town. We stayed open late, and after 9 o'clock in the evening, all the other businesses in the strip were closed, leaving the entire area dark except for my store, which was lit up like a beacon. Because the store was struggling financially, during the last 2 hours of the shift, the closing employee worked alone. I was always afraid someone would try to rob us. I was a 19-year-old girl, and it would have been incredibly easy for someone to target me, but I just kept going to work. There were apartments behind the store, so we had regular customers we were very familiar with who often cut through the parking lot to get to different places in the mall. It was common for them to wave, come in to say hello, or casually browse, and the atmosphere was usually relaxed. One night, I was closing the store alone, counting the tills and cleaning up. When I walked toward the front, I saw two male regulars standing outside the locked entrance. They were smiling, waving, and mouthing greetings. I waved back and continued working. I noticed they were not leaving, just standing there talking right outside the door. When it was time for me to leave, all my work was done, and it had been about 30 minutes. I checked the cameras and saw them still hanging around in the parking lot, surrounded by closed businesses. It was around 11:30 at night, and everything was shut down. Even though I recognized them, I would have had to walk past them to reach my car, and something did not feel right. I decided to play it safe and called my boyfriend, who is now my husband, and told him I had a strange feeling and asked if he could come so I could get to my car safely. As soon as he arrived, he got out, greeted the two men, and waited for me. The men immediately turned around and walked toward the apartments behind the store. I thought it was odd, but I went home and tried not to think about it. About a week later, one of those men was arrested for attempting to abduct a jogger at a park in town. When he was caught, he had rope, duct tape, and a knife in his bag, and it became major news. It also came out that he had previously been arrested years earlier for burning down a historical cabin. The man he had been with that night was a registered S offender. It has been about 15 years since then, and I still shudder to think about what could have happened if I had ignored that feeling in the back of my mind. Story 6. It was the day before my wedding, and I went for a walk around my very safe neighborhood. I had my headphones in with the music playing loudly. There were cars parked here and there along the long street, and the houses in the neighborhood sat on relatively large plots of land, leaving noticeable space between them. About halfway down the street, I passed a car that had been parked for at least the 5 minutes it had taken me to get there. As I walked by, I noticed there were 4, maybe 5 males inside who looked to be in their early 20s. I did not think much of it at the time. I walked another 50 or so feet when I suddenly got an awful feeling in my stomach. I turned around and saw that they had slowly crept their car forward and were now directly behind me. I had not heard the car move because my headphones were in. By pure luck, I spotted an older man and woman working in their garden about 5 houses down the street. Because of the large plots of land, they were still some distance away, but I ran straight to them and asked if I could wait with them. The older man walked over to the car and asked the group what they were doing there. They claimed they were there to do yard work for one of the neighbors and pointed to the house they were now parked in front of, which was not the same house they had originally been sitting in front of. The man told them he did not believe them and warned them to leave or he would call the police. He then told me that the house they had originally been parked in front of belonged to a neighbor who was out of town. Because the couple was several houses away, they had not noticed the car or me until I ran up to them. I often think back on that incident and feel strongly that if I had not gotten that awful feeling that made me turn around, and if that couple had not been outside for me to see, the story would have ended very differently, especially considering it happened the day before my wedding. Story 7, I have 2 experiences like this, and the first is why I will always trust my gut. When I was little, I often slept over at my cousin's house, where there was an amazing wooden bunk bed, and I always slept on the bottom bunk. When I was 7, I went over for another sleepover. We ate Chinese food with my aunt and uncle, then my cousin and I stayed up late playing video games before going to bed. As a child, I usually fell asleep immediately and slept very deeply. My family still jokes that not even a car crashing through the house could wake me up. Sometime after I fell asleep that night, I woke up with an overwhelming feeling that I had to roll over. I did not want to because I was comfortable, sleeping how I normally did, stretched out in the middle of the bed with one foot hanging off. I kept internally arguing with myself about it until I finally rolled over. Even then, the feeling was not satisfied, and I suddenly felt the urge to press myself as tightly as possible against the wall. Since I had already rolled over, I did it. As I was pushing myself against the wall, the bunk bed collapsed, and a broken metal bar went straight through the spot where I had been sleeping moments earlier. I was stuck, somehow completely unharmed, in that narrow space against the wall until my uncle could cut me out. My cousin fell from the top bunk when it collapsed but was also unharmed. The second experience happened when I was 16, during the summer. I grew up in a very small town and usually walked or biked everywhere alone with my dog. I had the day off from work, so I grabbed a book and walked with my dog, a Labrador, about 4 miles to one of my favorite lakes. I laid on the beach to read and tan, while my dog played in the water. After a few hours, I noticed a rowdy group of guys, one of whom looked familiar. It was a weekday, so aside from me, my dog, a fisherman at the landing, and this group, there was no one else around. I tried to ignore them, but I noticed they kept looking at me and whispering to each other. My dog, who usually stayed in the water the entire time, suddenly came over and laid down between me and the group. I got a bad feeling and decided to cut my day short. I packed up and started walking away as if nothing was wrong, and the group began to follow me. My dog was clearly distressed, constantly looking back and growling. The group grew louder behind me and somehow kept pace with me, even though I am a fast walker, which told me it was intentional. Knowing it was the middle of the week and help would be scarce, I tried to think of a way out. I focused on the one guy who looked familiar, and suddenly it clicked that I knew him. I spun around, addressed him by name, and told him I used to change his diapers, which caused his friends to burst out laughing. I allowed them to get close enough to talk while I asked him about his family and his brother, trying to keep control of the situation. When they asked what I was doing that day, I lied and said my brother was just up the road and I was on my way to meet him. I added that I would slow down and let them walk ahead because my dog seemed uneasy, lying again and saying she had been abused by a man and did not trust men. They said they were heading back to the beach, turned around, and left. About 1 year later, I heard about a horrific murder in the next town over. That same boy and his friends had broken into his 75-year-old grandfather's home, robbed him, and brutally killed him. The boy I recognized was 14 at the time, and the friends with him were between 16 and 23 years old. I do not know what they planned to do to me that day, but because of that moment, I have always trusted my gut, and I always will. Story 8. Nothing bad actually happened, but I was around 12 or 13 and taking horse riding lessons. I was usually in a group with 2 other girls, but that week neither of them showed up, which did not seem like a big issue. There was a new male instructor assigned to teach my lesson. Instead of using the usual riding ring near the stables, he took me to one about 5 minutes away on horseback, up on a hill surrounded by trees. I thought it was a bit odd since the regular ring was available. While we were riding up, he asked if I had a boyfriend, if I liked boys, and if I liked other boys my age. I was very shy back then and simply said I did not have a boyfriend and avoided answering the rest. When we arrived at the ring, he focused on my stirrups, saying they were not adjusted correctly, and even though I was experienced and knew they were fine, he kept readjusting them, touching my thighs more than necessary, while explaining how they were supposed to be positioned. Normally, that kind of contact is not unusual in horse riding, but I had a bad feeling, and I must have looked uncomfortable or too quiet because he said that I could tell him anything, and that anything that happened up there would be our secret. Then he asked me about boys again. I told him the stirrups were fine and that I was ready to start the lesson. This may sound unbelievable, but at that exact moment, the horse I was riding, usually a stubborn old animal who barely wanted to move, stomped his foot, took off, and started walking around the ring calmly, behaving perfectly for the entire lesson. On the walk back down to the stables, the horse kept stopping whenever the instructor got too close and gave small warning air bites when he did. Story 9. I was exploring an abandoned building with 2 friends when I was 15 or 16. It was a place we went to fairly often, so we knew most of the layout well and had a solid mental map of the main building and the smaller one nearby. One floor we had never explored was the basement. We knew a fire had started down there about a year earlier and that it was probably dangerous, but this time I had brought my father's tactical flashlight, which was extremely bright and decided it was finally time. We made our way to the main stairwell leading to the basement, and about halfway down I suddenly got goosebumps all over my body. My hands started shaking, and I felt like I could not breathe. I knew deep down that if we took even one more step, something terrible would happen, even though I did not know what. I told my friends exactly how I felt, and we trusted my instincts and turned back. The problem was that there was no direct exit from where we were, so we had to go up and down multiple floors just to make our way out. The bad feeling did not fade, and as we moved through the building, I started hearing footsteps from the floor above us, the same one we had just left, along with banging noises. I was absolutely terrified, but one of my friends managed to calm me down and helped guide us quickly through the more dangerous corridors, and we ran out of the building. As we left, I saw someone watching us from one of the windows, a man who looked like someone struggling heavily with substance use and clearly unhappy about being disturbed. About 6 months later, a different friend visited the building and said it reeked of human waste and that someone was definitely living there, but he refused to say anything more. We have all agreed to pretend it never happened, and now the only thing we worry about is whether we may have been exposed to asbestos, since the building was old and under construction when it caught fire. Story 10. A few years ago, I was coming back late at night on the Long Island Railroad from New York City. I got to my station and was waiting for my father to pick me up when a man approached me. He was a white male, well-groomed, well-dressed, and looked to be in his early to mid-40s. He tried to shake my hand and started talking to me. I do not remember exactly what he said because I was caught off guard, but the conversation seemed to be heading toward asking me for a favor. Within about 30 seconds, my father pulled up, and the man stopped mid-sentence and walked away without another word. Once I got in the car, my father told me the man was likely trying to lure me somewhere away from the front of the station, either to rob me or do something worse, possibly with help from others. I took it as a life lesson and never forgot it. Fast forward to about a month ago, I was filling up my car at a gas station while running errands with my wife. After standing there for a bit, I suddenly heard someone say, "Hey, buddy." Being from the New York City area, I usually ignore strangers, but something told me it was directed at me. The man said it again, closer this time, and when I finally looked up, I froze. He looked almost identical to the man from the train station. White, well-groomed, well-dressed, and in his early to mid-40s. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up, and I raised my voice and told him I could not help him and that I was in a hurry. He tried to say he could do me a favor if I helped him out, but I repeated myself firmly, finished what I was doing, and he quickly left. To be fair, both men could have genuinely needed help, and I will never know, and I am fine with that. Trusting my instincts has kept me safe. One last unsettling detail is that when I got back into the car, my wife asked what had happened and mentioned she had heard about people placing tracking devices on cars. She told me she noticed the man resting his hand on my car, something I had not even realized. We checked the vehicle later and did not find anything, but it reinforced the importance of listening to your gut and never ignoring that inner warning. Story 11. I was walking home from my bus stop one day, listening to music through my headphones and completely lost in my own little world. Halfway home, the battery died, and suddenly I heard a man walking behind me, talking out loud about how he could never get women to talk to him. I glanced over my shoulder and realized he was alone, had gotten off the same bus as me, and was easily twice my size. That meant he had been following me for about 3 or 4 blocks, apparently trying to get my attention the entire time. There was no one else around. I kept my headphones on despite the lack of music and started walking faster. Then he began singing, repeating over and over, "Speak to the girl. You got to. You got to speak to the girl." Getting louder the farther ahead of him I got. I had no idea what to do. If I went straight home, he would know exactly where I lived. Instead, I turned a corner toward an area where I knew there would be more people around, with him still following me, and ducked into a pub. When he followed me inside, I ran up to the bartender and begged him to pretend we were friends and stay with me until the man left. The bartender immediately came out from behind the bar, gave me a big hug, and made a show of chatting with me until the man finally went away, and I stopped shaking quite so badly. Not all heroes wear capes. Story 12. This is not my story, but one my ex told me from when she was in her 20s, back in the 1990s, in the United Kingdom. She was on a train heading home from work on a local service that stopped at many small stations, roughly every 10 to 15 minutes. She was sitting there reading a book when the train stopped at a small station, and she glanced up as new passengers boarded. One man got on, and the moment she saw him, her stomach dropped. She described him as the most ordinary-looking man imaginable, a slightly overweight white man of average height in his late 40s or early 50s. But there was an overwhelming sense of danger about him. She remembers silently begging that he would not sit near her, but he sat directly beside her. He was completely unremarkable in appearance, yet her instincts were screaming at her to run. A few stops later, two younger men boarded the train and sat directly across from her and the older man. Almost immediately, they started harassing her, trying to get her attention, which she ignored. They grew louder and more aggressive, and she became increasingly uncomfortable, but was too afraid to squeeze past the older man to move seats. As the situation escalated, she heard an annoyed sigh from the man beside her, and then he spoke. He calmly told the two young men to be quiet. They immediately turned their attention toward him, insulting him, but he simply stared at them. They became quieter and quieter until one of them asked what he was looking at, and the older man replied with a single word, "You." She said her blood ran cold at that moment. He never raised his voice, threatened them, or acted violently. Yet his presence was deeply intimidating. The two young men fell completely silent and got off at the very next stop. My ex turned to thank the man for stepping in, which she later realized was a mistake. He turned toward her, slowly looked her up and down, and she felt like prey being evaluated. Whatever he was considering, she failed whatever test he had in mind. He turned back to face forward and never said a word to her. A few stops later, she got off the train, convinced he would follow her. She had a 20-minute walk home and said it was the longest walk of her life, but she made it home safely and never saw him again. Story 13. To be clear, I am not a believer in the paranormal at all, and I would not even call myself a skeptic, because I simply do not believe in that kind of thing. That said, there is an old abandoned mental institution in my hometown that is somewhat infamous for being featured in ghost hunting shows, mostly online ones. Growing up there, you hear countless stories about it, and naturally, as teenagers, my friends and I decided to go explore it. It is a large plantation-style building with 4 stories if you count the basement, sitting alone in a field at the end of a long road lined with creepy trees and no streetlights, straight out of a horror movie. We went there multiple times and nothing ever happened. We would walk around, explore, and eventually leave, completely uneventful, except for the last time. On roughly our 10th visit, every single person in our group felt something was wrong the moment we stepped onto the road and looked down it into the darkness. We walked about 100 yards to the first gate when I finally said that something felt off. I felt genuine fear, like there was something intensely evil waiting at the end of that road, like someone was watching us from the darkness. Every single one of my friends admitted they felt the same way. We immediately turned around and left. A few weeks later, they went back without me. I refused to go again because that last experience unsettled me enough to be done with it. They later told me they experienced several strange things, including recording what was almost certainly a squatter running across the floor above them. Nothing truly extreme happened, but to this day I have never felt a presence or instinct like that again. Story 14. When I was a struggling college student with very little money, I lived a few miles away from campus in an area where buses did not run frequently, so I became very used to walking everywhere in the city. There was a lot of poverty in that area, so I often ended up talking with people who were unhoused. I would say that about 80% of the time, they would just make small talk and then ask for money, which I usually did not have. But if they were kind, I would sometimes give a few dollars when I could. Others were pushy or mean about it. One afternoon, a man started hassling me near a Burger King when I truly did not have any money at all. I apologized and kept walking. It was late afternoon in the middle of summer, and after I crossed the street, he was already out of my mind. Then I heard shouting. I looked back and saw it was the same man yelling at me from the Burger King, but now he had his hood up. I kept walking, used to that kind of thing by then. As I continued, I suddenly got this intense, anxious feeling and thought I needed to get to campus immediately, where it was well lit and felt safer. I glanced over my shoulder a few times and did not see him, so I told myself I was overreacting, but I still picked up my pace. I went out of my way to reach campus even though I did not need to be there. After walking about 30 yards onto campus property, I turned around and saw the man standing exactly where I had stepped onto campus, staring straight at me. He was perfectly framed between the trees, hands in his hoodie pockets, with the hood pulled tight so I could not see his face. Story 15. My experience happened many years ago on a blind date. A former friend, without asking, set me up with a firefighter who worked with her boyfriend. I agreed to meet him at a familiar, busy sports bar type restaurant, a place I could afford since I always paid my own way. When we were introduced, I immediately felt uneasy because he was very intimidating, and that is not something that normally affects me. That was the first warning sign, but I ignored it and decided not to judge him too quickly, even though instinctively I knew better. As we talked, he told me he was separated, had 2 children, and was in the process of divorcing. That alone did not bother me. Then he told me his wife had a restraining order against him. At that point, the warning signs were everywhere. He went on to explain that it was her fault he had hurt her because she had made him angry. Our food had not even arrived yet, and I wanted to leave immediately, but I was afraid that if I did, he would follow me out to the parking lot. I stayed, listened, and made it clear that I had to be at work very early the next morning. He told me I was such a good listener and that he wished more women were like me. What I really wanted to say was that he terrified me and I wanted to stay alive. When it was time to leave, I declined his offer to walk me to my car. Thankfully, I had parked close to the restaurant while he was parked much farther away. I had not even pulled out of my parking space when he texted me asking for another date. I did not respond. He continued texting me throughout the next day while I was at work. Then he sent a message that truly frightened me, saying he had friends in law enforcement who could track my phone number to my address, and that if I did not respond, he would come to my home. That was enough for me. I do not tolerate threats. I worked near state police offices at the time and showed them the messages. I also contacted my phone provider and had my number changed immediately. Story 16. I was working on a turtle conservation project in Cyprus several years ago on a remote beach in the middle of the night. One of the nests had started hatching, and all the baby turtles were collected into a bucket. They are kept at the center for about a year and then released, which gives them a much better chance of survival. I was carrying the full bucket of hatchlings back to the center, which required about a 20-minute walk in complete darkness along the beach. There were other nests that looked promising, so the other volunteers stayed behind while I headed off alone. About halfway along the beach, my headlamp suddenly dimmed badly because the batteries were almost dead, and the beach instantly felt much more threatening. Then I heard a noise coming from the dunes. I looked over, but in the weak light I could not see anything at first. Then a pair of bright, glowing eyes appeared at the top of a dune. I could see the outline of the dune against the stars, but not the body attached to the eyes. The eyes started moving down the dune, not in a human way, but clearly like an animal. As it got closer, the eyes grew brighter until I could finally make out a massive dark shape around them. My legs locked, and I knew I could not move or outrun whatever it was. In that moment, I truly thought I was about to die. When it finally entered the small circle of light from my lamp, I realized it was a dog, which did not make me feel any safer. It was a huge black German Shepherd type dog with pale eyes, clearly feral and underfed. It was more than half my height and likely desperate for food. I remembered that one of the biggest threats to turtle hatchlings there was wild dogs digging up nests, and I was essentially carrying a bucket of food straight to it. Somehow, despite being absolutely terrified, I decided that if I was there to protect these animals, I was not going to give them up. Everything happened in seconds as the dog charged toward me, my light barely reaching 2 meters ahead. I shouted at it, though I do not remember what I yelled or if it was even words. Somehow it worked. The dog turned and ran back into the dunes. I walked back to the center much faster than usual, my heart pounding and every nerve on edge, expecting to hear it return at any moment, but I made it safely. After that night, I always carried spare batteries for my headlamp, and no one ever walked those beaches alone again. Story 17. I live in Tornado Alley in the United States, which means I have a healthy respect for the devastation tornadoes can cause. But I am also very used to tornado warnings. One afternoon, it had just started to get rainy when I saw on Facebook that a meteorologist friend of mine was tracking a storm with tornado potential whose projected path would cross very near my basementless apartment. I started monitoring the storm myself, and by the time the sirens went off, I was already familiar with its path. It was moving north-northeast and would likely pass north and west of my home, but far too close for comfort. Because we would have had to leave our apartment to reach shelter, which meant driving to a grocery store 3 minutes away that was still within the tornado's path, I made the call, and my then fiance agreed that instead we should take the highway east and then south, completely out of town and away from the projected path, and return after about half an hour once the storm passed. We put our cat into her crate and got into the car as light rain began to fall, with me driving. As we got onto the highway, we could clearly see the storm approaching, a massive wall covering the southwestern horizon. During the 5 minutes we drove east, we kept glancing at that dark curtain of rain and clouds, commenting that the tornado had to be somewhere behind it. We then turned south onto the main highway and accelerated out of town. After about half a mile south, I noticed we were about to hit much heavier rain, so I sped up slightly to try to outrun the worst of it. The closer we got, the more uneasy I felt, especially as I noticed how fast the rain was racing from right to left across the treetops. Another half-mile later, my discomfort intensified just as we reached an intersection where about half a dozen cars were pulled over, not from an accident, but intentionally. That was when I noticed a tornado tank, one of those heavily modified armored vehicles designed to withstand extreme winds, parked at the intersection. In that instant, it hit me that we were in exactly the wrong place. My stomach dropped, adrenaline surged, and I spun the car around in the intersection and accelerated northbound as fast as I safely could, desperate to get away. The rain intensified, and just before visibility dropped, my fiancé snapped a photo of a sharp wall of rain crossing the road behind us, daylight on one side and dark gray on the other. As the storm overtook us, the radio broadcast on National Public Radio was interrupted by a repeating emergency message warning that a confirmed, large, and extremely dangerous tornado was heading toward our town and instructing everyone to seek shelter immediately. For several minutes, my only focus was driving north and avoiding an accident. It was not until we reached a business, ran inside, and took shelter in a storeroom that we truly understood what had happened. As we left our apartment, the tornado had abruptly changed direction, veering almost due east instead of continuing north on the west side of town. By heading southeast, we had unknowingly driven directly into its path. After the storm passed and we returned home, we checked the weather reports and learned the tornado had been classified as an enhanced Fujita 4 with a footprint nearly a mile wide. That was when another realization hit me hard. When we had said the tornado was somewhere behind that wall of rain, the tornado had been the entire wall of rain. The whole time we were driving, we had been heading straight toward a life-threatening tornado without realizing it. The next day, I drove back to the area and saw that the intersection where we turned around was about 100 feet from the northern edge of a mile-wide swath of total destruction, with massive oak trees snapped, uprooted, and scattered across farmland. If we had stopped there, we would have been hit by flying debris, and if we had continued south, we would have driven straight into the core. It was a terrible mistake, and one I will never forget. Do not try to outrun tornadoes, and do not assume you can avoid them by driving away. Story 18. I was 19 years old and went on what turned into a 3-day substance binge, during which I made the terrible decision to take acid. To shorten the story a bit, I ended up running away from home and setting my global positioning system for Wisconsin, and to this day I have no idea why I chose that destination. By the time this happened, I was sober but had not slept in several days. I missed an exit, and the navigation told me to take the next one. That exit led me onto a dirt road deep in the woods of Arkansas. I drove for a short distance before thinking something felt very wrong, So I zoomed out on the map and saw nothing but endless twists and turns through a dark forest. I checked my fuel gauge and realized I only had about 60 miles of gas left. I stopped and weighed my options, either continue and risk getting stranded in the middle of the forest at 4 in the morning or turn around and find fuel. As I was thinking, I suddenly felt like I was being watched, and my heart began pounding. That was enough for me. I could not turn the car around because the road was too narrow, so I put it in reverse and sped out the way I had come. I drove straight home at high speed, not stopping for anything, absolutely terrified. Sometime later, I came across a video online that talked about that same forest, which turns out to be one of the areas in the United States where an unusually high number of people go missing. Many people describe feeling that same overwhelming sense of being watched, and some even claim to see things. I do not believe in ghosts or anything like that, but what unsettles me is that when I tried to find that same road again, using my navigation system, it no longer appeared. Whatever it was, the experience scared me badly enough that I admitted myself into rehabilitation and got sober, so at least there was a positive ending to it all. Story 19. My friend and I were outside one evening, and I think we were around 14 years old when a group of guys approached us. They looked to be around 17 or so. It was already dark, and we were hanging out near a playground. I immediately got a gut feeling that we needed to leave, but unfortunately, my friend did not listen. She loved attention and thrived on the thrill of situations like that. I did not. By the time I realized she was not going to leave with me, the guys had already surrounded us. That is when I ran as fast as I could, dropping my bag and kicking off my heeled boots while I ran so I could move faster. Thankfully, my friend ran with me too. I lived nearby, and my dad drove to the area. We found my bag and my boots, but my phone and wallet were gone. My dad drove around the neighborhood, and we ended up finding the guys. He completely lost his temper and demanded my belongings back, then called the police. They came, but I honestly do not remember what happened after that. I never got my phone or wallet back. I am just glad nothing worse happened, because everything about that situation felt wrong, and I am sure we would have been assaulted if we had not run. I am very good with faces, and the main guy who talked to us, the creepiest of them all, died years later in a car crash. The last time I felt that same gut instinct was about my dad. He had suffered a stroke and had been hospitalized for 17 days. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, so there was no clear reason to worry. One Saturday night, while putting something in my handbag, I suddenly felt violently sick, like my insides were twisting and I was about to throw up. I told my mom I had a terrible feeling about my dad. A few minutes later, my stepmother called and told us we needed to come to the hospital because things were not going well, and they thought we should say goodbye. I arrived about half an hour later, and my dad seemed happy. He was trying to sing, even though he had lost the ability to speak properly and could only mumble. He told us he loved us in his own way and hugged us. We left the hospital confused. The next morning, he passed away. They say it is common for patients to rally like that at the end, that they sense it coming and want one last moment of peace. It made saying goodbye harder, but I am grateful for that moment. I only wish I had had him in my life longer than 25 years. Almost 2 years later, I still miss him deeply. Story 20. My roommate and I pulled out of our driveway, which was part of a row of duplexes, to go get food, and there was a man on the sidewalk out front just wandering near some parked cars. I immediately knew something was wrong and mentioned it to my roommate, but he just shrugged it off. By the time we reached the stoplight about 30 seconds away, he looked at me again and asked if I was okay and said we could go back if I wanted. I told him yes. We turned around and the man was still there. My roommate thought maybe he was looking into cars for valuables, but when we pulled up, I got out and asked him if I could help him with something. He just pointed at the car next to him. It turned out the man was mentally disabled, and there was an older woman in the car who was passed out. It was the middle of summer, well over 90 degrees outside. My roommate and I immediately called emergency services, and he went to the car to try to get her to sit up because her breathing was uneven and she was slumped over. The man had been trying to call his mother because he did not know what to do. He just knew something was very wrong with the woman. She never became responsive while we were there, but later we were told the paramedics managed to get some information from her, and used her phone to contact her son. I do not know if she ended up being okay, but I am certain she would have died if we had not turned back, and I truly hope we saved her life. Story 21. More than 10 years ago, we were visiting hot springs in northern Alaska. There is a well-known one called Chena, and there was supposed to be another one called Circle Hot Springs somewhere farther out. We must have taken a wrong turn because we got completely lost. We drove more than 10 miles down a crushed granite road and saw only one other car along the way, sitting there with two blown tires, which made us uneasy. We kept going, thinking we would reach our destination soon. Eventually, we saw a small sign for a motel and gas station and decided to pull in. It felt like something straight out of a horror movie. The motel had every window broken, with old mattresses shoved against the openings. The gas station had only one pump, and the door was standing open. We went inside to ask for directions, and there was old music playing from a radio somewhere in the back. An ashtray sat on the counter with a cigarette still burning. We called out for someone, but no one answered. We checked the bathroom, which was empty but completely filthy beyond description. We considered grabbing drinks from the cooler and leaving money on the counter, but when we opened it, all the drinks were warm. We were desperate for directions because we had no cell service, so we walked around the building to see if someone had stepped out back. All we found was a dead dog, partially decomposed near the back door. We looked at each other and knew immediately that something was very wrong. We left as quickly as we could, hoping we would not end up with a flat tire like the car we had seen earlier, which was gone when we drove back out. I am fairly certain no tow truck could have reached such a remote area that quickly, and to this day, that place still unsettles me. Story 22. I was running at a park when I noticed a small blue truck pass me, and I had the strange feeling that the driver was watching me through the rearview mirror. I got a little creeped out, but immediately told myself I was overreacting because I watch too many crime shows and tend to scare myself. About 10 minutes later, I noticed the same truck pass me again. The park has a circular layout with a one-way road, which meant they had driven all the way around the park and come back. That was when I started to feel genuinely nervous. I slowed my pace to create more distance and eventually stopped. A woman who I often saw running there but had never spoken to came up behind me and greeted me. She told me she had the same bad feeling about the truck and asked if we could run together. I agreed, and as we ran, we talked about possibly calling the police. When we reached the top of a hill, we saw a police officer on a bicycle and immediately ran over to him. He listened to us, took down the license plate, and called for another officer to pull the truck over, since other people in the park had already reported it. Apparently, the truck had been looping the park several times and slowing down near female runners. I was extremely grateful that the other runner spoke up and asked to stay together, because who knows what could have happened if either of us had been alone. The police escorted us to our cars and out of the park. I never found out what happened to the driver, but I was relieved to be safe and surrounded by people who paid attention. Story 23. We were in 10th grade, which in India is considered the final year of high school and is extremely important for getting into good colleges later on. Because of that, before school even opened, we attended private tutoring classes every morning from 5 in the morning until 6:30, 7 days a week. Some kids in our group came from wealthy families and rode scooters or motorcycles, while most of us rode bicycles. One morning after class, as we were heading home, one of the rich kids asked my friend to ride with him on his motorcycle instead of taking his bicycle. The moment he asked, I got goosebumps and felt a deep sense of unease and nausea. I told my friend, who I will call TG, not to go and to ride back with us instead. I was mocked for being scared of the dark, and since it was a cold winter morning, TG just wanted to get home quickly. Another friend, CT, suddenly hugged TG for no reason and later said he did not know why, but felt overwhelming sadness for him. We all started heading home, while TG and the others on motorcycles stayed behind talking. A short distance down the road, they sped past us, laughing and racing. Only a few meters later, one of the motorcycles skidded on loose sand, and TG was thrown under a truck carrying construction sand. The sound of the brakes was terrifying. We ran toward the scene and found TG under the rear wheels of the truck, strangely laughing and asking where his backpack was. We were frozen in shock, unable to process what we were seeing. When TG looked down at himself, he lost consciousness. We were 14 or 15 years old and ran around desperately trying to get help, barely able to speak. Other drivers eventually came to assist, but the truck driver fled the scene. TG passed away later that afternoon, and that moment has never left me. Story 24. This is not my story, but my uncle's. My uncle owned a Tibetan Mastiff, a massive and powerful dog known for being intelligent, stubborn, and extremely strong. Definitely not a beginner-friendly breed. My uncle lived in China during the 1970s and was a man of strict routine. Every morning, he woke up at the same time and took the same crowded bus to work. For 8 or 9 years, the dog would greet him every morning as he left, and again when he returned home. One morning, everything seemed normal until my uncle tried to leave the house. The dog absolutely refused to let him go. It repeatedly placed its body between my uncle and the door and became increasingly agitated, even growling, which it had never done before in all its years. My uncle said this behavior was completely unprecedented. Running late for work, my uncle, his wife, and their 2 sons forced the dog into the master bedroom on the second floor and locked the door. Already missing his bus, my uncle rushed outside, and suddenly there was a loud crash. The dog had broken through the second-story window, jumped out, and died in front of him. My uncle was devastated and deeply disturbed by what had happened, unable to understand why his loyal and well-behaved dog would act that way. Feeling that something was terribly wrong, he decided not to go to work that day and did not take the bus. That evening, the news reported that the bus my uncle took every single day had been involved in a major accident, killing more than 15 people. To this day, my uncle firmly believes that his dog somehow sensed what was coming and did everything it could to stop him from leaving the house that morning. Story 25. My now wife was going to a party and I could not make it. But I was already uneasy about her going because I did not trust that group of friends she had at the time. I received a text from her saying she needed my help and that she was being harassed by a group of guys who would not let her leave, grabbing her and trying to force her back into the house. My phone was almost dead. I had no car and no wallet, and I could not reach any friends to meet me there, so I went anyway with nothing. I took a cab and got dropped off out front, already knowing it was going to be bad. When I got inside, she had locked herself in the bathroom, and there were several guys standing outside the door talking to her. I pushed through, told her I was there, and that we were leaving, and when she opened the door and we started to walk out, one of the guys grabbed her arm and said she was not going anywhere. I hit him in the face, and he went down hard, bleeding badly from the nose. That was my first mistake. One of his friends stepped up, challenging me, and instead of doing what I should have done and just getting out of there, I stood my ground, bumping chests and telling them to leave and take their friends with them. After a tense back and forth, they eventually left. The next mistake was staying. I had no phone, no money, and her phone had been taken. One of her friends apologized and insisted we stay while she called a cab, which she never actually did. About an hour later, around 8 guys showed up looking for me. We tried to run, made it through a side gate, and suddenly they were all around us. My wife was running ahead when one of them went after her. I chased him, grabbed him when he grabbed her, and he pulled out a baton and struck me in the ribs. I took it from him, and after that, I do not remember what happened. I woke up from a coma a week later with my ear reattached, stab wounds in my back, several broken ribs, dozens of fractures in my face, a shattered jaw, and a broken eye socket. Over the next 6 years, I had to undergo multiple reconstructive surgeries. I was later told that my wife ran to the nearest house, banged on the door, and the husband came out and helped me before the police arrived. The police did not even call an ambulance at first. I was unconscious, and the people at the party claimed I had been drunk and abusive. My wife had to beg them to call for medical help, insisting I had not been drinking. I had to save tens of thousands of dollars for surgery because proper jaw function was considered elective. I had to work nonstop to afford it by the time I was 20. Story 26. A few years ago, I went out to bars with 2 friends, 1 woman and 1 man. At the first bar, we noticed 2 guys who seemed to be together. They looked at me but did not approach, and I did not think much of it. We left for another bar, and as we walked in, we saw the same 2 guys walking past outside, not entering. About an hour later, we went to a third bar, and one of those guys approached me and offered to buy me a drink. I watched the bartender make it and drank it, and nothing seemed wrong. Shortly after, a couple of girls appeared and joined us, apparently part of the same friend group. They were overly friendly, constantly offering me water and hovering. The guy asked for my number, and I gave it to him, planning to block him later if needed. He then told me that one of his friends had been watching me at the previous bar, so he would know where I was. That immediately made me uncomfortable. After a while, all three of us felt something was off, so we said we were going to the bathroom and left. Later that night at another bar, I saw them again, and the guy started texting me angrily, saying he saw me dancing with someone else. He kept messaging me, insisting we meet alone after the bars closed. It became unsettling, and I stopped responding. About a week later, I went to lunch with my mother and sister, and one of the women from that same group was working at the restaurant. She came to take our drink order and then never returned. My mother asked another server for her name, and shortly after that, I received a text from the guy apologizing for the previous weekend. After that, my friends and I noticed that the same group of people always appeared together around town, and they strongly believed that something had been planned. I am grateful I trusted my instincts and left when I did. Story 27. I live in Southern California and used to road bike pretty frequently, usually in the late afternoon or evening after school during the week. One day I got a late start, and by the time I got onto the riverbed trail, the sunset was about 20 to 30 minutes away. I had lights on my bike, so riding at night was normally not an issue. I reached the beach at the end of the trail, which was my usual turning point, when I suddenly felt a strong sense of dread mixed with déjà vu. I turned back, and by then the sun had fully set and it was deep into blue hour, almost complete night. I had done this exact ride hundreds of times and knew the route as well as my own home. There are usually 3 different ways I take back, and because it was later than usual and I felt uneasy, I chose the shortest route. As I came to a small crosswalk, I saw a group of 3 teenagers, and I was about 22 at the time, walking toward me in the opposite direction. One of them was giving another a piggyback ride, which did not seem strange at first, but as I passed them, I realized it was a girl being carried, and her face was covered in blood. I immediately skidded to a stop and turned around. They noticed and took off running, dropping her. I called the police and stayed with her. She was badly injured, and it was clear she had been severely beaten and was being taken somewhere against her will. The trail had been unusually empty that day, and if I had chosen a different route or left at my normal time, I do not know what would have happened to her. Story 28. When I was around 9 years old, my family traveled to South America to visit relatives. We stayed at my aunt's house, which was a few streets away from my grandmother's. One evening, while everyone else was at my grandmother's house, I was alone at my aunt's watching television. It got dark and I became scared, so I decided to walk to my grandmother's. As I was walking alone, I noticed a white van driving beside me but never passing. It was unsettling that the van was moving at the same pace I was walking, but I was too afraid to turn around and just kept going. Suddenly, the van stopped and someone got out. I finally looked back and saw a bald man, around 45 years old, wearing a white shirt and jeans, walking toward me. I crossed the street to see if he would follow, and he crossed as well. Then I walked between 2 cars parked bumper to bumper, almost getting stuck because they were so close together, thinking that if he followed me through there, it would confirm I was in danger. He did. When he noticed I was panicking, he sped up and got very close, about 2 meters behind me. I stopped pretending I had not noticed him and started running, and he ran after me. About 10 seconds later, I saw a small neighborhood shop that was still open and ran inside as fast as I could. The owner knew my grandmother and helped me call for someone to come get me. More than 20 years later, I still remember exactly what that man looked like. Story 29. A few years back, one of my favorite places for late-night walks was the local cemetery. There was something peaceful and surreal about walking through it at night, and I always had my dogs with me. I had experienced a few strange encounters there before, mostly random cars slowly following me that had no real reason to be there so late. One particular night, around 2 in the morning, I was walking there in the middle of winter while snow was falling heavily. The cemetery had winding paths and trees and looked almost beautiful under the snow. When I reached the top of a hill, I noticed a fairly large black object on the side of the road. I immediately felt uneasy as I tried to figure out what it was. As I got closer, I realized it was a coffin.